A spoiled 21-year-old millionaire took a dare to work as a rideshare driver for 1 week, and the passenger he picked up on day one would completely shatter everything he thought he knew about himself. Before we start the story, tell us in the comments what city you are watching from. And at the end, don't forget to rate this story from 0 to 10. Enjoy the story. He sat in his luxury car, hands shaking as he read the text message on his phone, the one that changed everything. She was gone. Not because she wanted to leave, but because his world had finally caught up with his choices. And standing outside the hospital window, watching her through the glass, he realized he'd spent 21 years becoming a man he hated, and only 7 days trying to become someone worth saving. But to understand how a single week could completely rewrite a man's entire existence, we have to go back. Back to the moment when everything fell apart. Back to the night when a father finally said, "Enough," and a son was forced to finally listen. The penthouse didn't just overlook the city, it consumed it. From the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Crawford family's Manhattan masterpiece, you could see the entire sprawl of New York laid out like a game board. A kingdom of lights and ambition stretched across the dark canvas of the Hudson River. The furniture was museum quality. The art on the walls, actual Rothkos, actual Warhols, represented more money than most people would make in 10 lifetimes. The air itself seemed polished, and in the center of all this manufactured perfection sat James Crawford, 21 years old, heir to a $3 billion real estate empire, and quite possibly the most catastrophically wasted human being in the entire tri-state area. He was sprawled across an Italian leather sofa that probably cost more than a house, still wearing yesterday's clothes, with an empty bottle of 1985 Chateau Petrus on the glass coffee table beside him. His hair, which had been professionally styled just 2 days ago, now stuck up at odd angles, matted on one side from where he'd been sleeping. There was a smudge of what might have been lipstick on his collar. Or it could have been something worse. At this point, James had stopped keeping track. His phone buzzed. Then buzzed again. Then again. Without opening his eyes, he reached blindly across the sofa cushion until his fingers found the device. The screen lit up his face, pale, handsome in an exhausted, debauched sort of way, revealing a cascade of messages from his father. All caps. All fury. James, we need to talk. This is not acceptable. Get to the office. Now, I'm not joking with you anymore. James let the phone drop back onto his chest and groaned. His father's fury was predictable at this point. In fact, he could probably script the entire conversation before it happened. Richard Crawford would storm around his office like a man having a coronary, his face turning that particular shade of purple that doctors warned about. He'd say something about squandering the family legacy and throwing away opportunity and acting like a spoiled child. James's mother would probably be there too, standing by the window with that expression on her face, the one that looked like disappointment mixed with worry. And it somehow felt worse than his father's rage. It always played out the same way. But here's what people didn't understand about being James Crawford. Consequences were an abstract concept, something that happened to other people. When you grew up in a penthouse and had a credit card with no limit attached to your name, when your parents' wealth was so staggering that even spectacular failure registered as barely a blip on the financial radar, accountability became almost quaint. Last month, he'd crashed a rented Lamborghini into a fountain in Central Park at 3 a.m. His father had paid for the damages and the fountain restoration before lunch. The month before that, he'd thrown a party in the penthouse that got so out of hand that the neighbors filed a noise complaint with the police. The cops had shown up, recognized the address, and basically just suggested he keep the music down. They were apologetic about even being there. This was James Crawford's life, a series of escalating indulgences with zero lasting consequences. But something had shifted in his father's voice in these text messages. There was a finality to it, a break in the pattern. He should have paid closer attention. James dragged himself off the sofa at around 2 in the afternoon, took a shower that did little to improve his general condition, and threw on the kind of clothes that cost as much as a monthly salary for most people: designer jeans, a shirt from a boutique in Soho that only existed by invitation. He looked in the mirror and saw what everyone else always saw: a beautiful, well-off young man who seemed to have it all figured out. He didn't see the emptiness. He didn't see the rot. The walk from the penthouse to his father's office building took about 15 minutes. James took his time, stopping for an overpriced coffee he wouldn't finish, checking his phone for messages from the girl whose name he genuinely couldn't remember. Was it Brittany? Bethany? Brenda? Didn't matter. There were always more where she came from. That was the point of being James Crawford. You were always at the top of a very long list. When he walked into his father's office on the 32nd floor, Richard Crawford was standing at the window, staring down at the city with the expression of a man who'd been betrayed by the world. His mother, Catherine, was sitting in one of the uncomfortable leather chairs, her purse clutched in her lap, her eyes red-rimmed from crying. James felt a flutter of something. Not guilt. Guilt was still abstract, but something close to concern. This was different. He could feel it. "We're pulling the plug," Richard said without turning around. "The plug on what?" James knew the answer, but he asked anyway. It was a stalling tactic. His father finally turned to face him. There was no anger in his face anymore. That would have been better. Anger, James understood. Anger was a language they could both speak. What he saw instead was exhaustion. Disappointment so complete, it looked like mourning. "On you," Richard said quietly. "On this circus. On pretending that money and heritage can somehow override the fact that you're becoming nothing. A waste. A cautionary tale." Catherine made a small sound, a cross between a sob and a gasp. James felt his jaw tighten. "Dad, come on. I was at a party last night. It got a little wild." "That doesn't mean you drove someone's car into the East River," Richard interrupted. "The vehicle was still running when they pulled it out of the water. The person in the passenger seat nearly drowned." James blinked. That detail was fuzzy. Had there been someone in the car? He searched his memory and found only fragments, like trying to piece together a photograph that was torn and partially burned. "He's fine," James said, which he knew, even as the words left his mouth, sounded like the absolute worst thing he could say. "Is he?" His father stepped closer. "Because the hospital says otherwise. And I've been sitting in my office for the past 3 hours dealing with lawyers because I'm terrified of what happens if this young man decides he wants to press charges. Do you understand me, James? Do you have even the slightest comprehension of what I'm telling you? I understand you're mad. I understand it was stupid. But Richard, don't call me Richard," his father said, and something in his voice was so defeated that it actually, finally, cut through the fog of James's entitlement. "I haven't earned the right to be spoken to like we're peers. I've earned the right to be your father, and I have failed spectacularly at that. So I'm going to try something different." He walked over to his desk and pulled out an envelope. He didn't hand it to James. Instead, he set it on the mahogany surface and stepped back. In that envelope, is a bank card connected to an account that contains exactly $2,000, Richard said. That's your monthly allowance, starting immediately. Cut down from what you've been spending in a week. The penthouse is mine. The car collection is mine. Your trust fund is locked until you turn 25, and you can contest that in court if you'd like. But you'll lose. Your mother and I have spent the last 3 hours with our lawyers, making absolutely certain of that. James felt the ground tilting beneath him. This wasn't how the pattern worked. There were supposed to be negotiations, room for maneuvering, a pathway back to normalcy. Your clothes, your personal items, you can keep, Richard continued. But starting tomorrow morning, you're going to have something you've never had before in your life. A job. Catherine was crying openly now. James watched her shoulders shake and felt something twisted in his chest. Guilt? Fear? Or just the simple shock of consequence finally catching up with him? I don't understand, James said. No, his father agreed. You don't. That's the problem. So here's your new curriculum, James. You're going to work for 1 week as a rideshare driver for a company called Horizon. You'll drive people around this city. You'll see what it actually means to work for money. You'll talk to people who are struggling, who are trying, who are doing something with their lives besides throwing it away. This is insane, James said, but his voice had lost its certainty. It is, Richard agreed, but so is watching your son become a person you don't recognize. A week, James. 7 days. After that, if you want to come home, if you want to have a conversation about your future that doesn't involve court dates, we can talk. But not before. Not unless you can show me that you've learned something, that you've seen something, that you've become something other than this. He gestured vaguely in James's direction, and James understood that he was looking at himself through his father's eyes. A beautiful disaster. A walking tragedy. Someone worth knowing had been buried under the weight of privilege and indulgence. And, if you're wondering if I'm serious, Richard added, I want you to know that I've already spoken to your mother, and we're completely unified on this. If you try to access your other resources, if you try to go around us or manipulate your way back into the penthouse, you're done, not grounded, not temporarily cut off. Done. We have other children? No, we don't. But we could adopt some, and I suspect they would be more worth our time and money. The words were said calmly, almost kindly, and that's what made them land like a punch. His father wasn't even angry anymore. He'd moved past anger into something more final. Acceptance. The acceptance that the son he'd raised was a failure, and the only question left was whether that failure was permanent. Catherine stood up and walked to James. She looked at him, really looked at him, and then she reached out and touched his face with her hand. It was the most devastating thing she could have done. I love you, she said quietly, but I don't like the man you're becoming. So please, please just try. For us. For yourself. She left the office. His father sat back down at his desk, and that's when James understood it was over. Not the conversation. The entire infrastructure of his life. It was done. Everything he'd taken for granted had just been pulled out from underneath him, and he was in free fall. The agency will contact you this evening, Richard said, looking back at his computer, as if the conversation had already concluded. You start tomorrow morning at 6. That's when the first shift begins. I've prepaid for an Airbnb room in the Yabuki Outer Boroughs, someplace that costs about $150 a night, which is what a working person might actually spend. You'll need that space. You're not living at home while you do this. And if I refuse, The words came out almost automatically. His father looked up at him, and there was something final in his expression. "Then you're no longer my son. Not officially, not legally, not in the way that matters. You'll be an adult who's homeless and broke, and you'll learn the same lesson the hard way, just with more suffering. I'd prefer you learn it my way, but I've come to realize I have less control over my children than I thought." James turned and left the office without another word. He couldn't think of anything to say that wouldn't make it worse. As he walked toward the elevator, his father's voice called out one last time, "James?" He turned back. Richard was standing in the doorway of his office, and for just a moment, James saw something break in his father's face. Love and disappointment and desperate hope all tangled together. "I still believe you're capable of being someone worth knowing," Richard said. "I just need you to believe it too." The elevator doors closed before James could respond. But as he descended through the floors of the building, watching the city get larger in the reflections of the polished steel walls, he felt the first genuine moment of fear he'd experienced in years. Not the fear of getting in trouble. This was different. This was the fear that maybe his father was right. That maybe there was nothing underneath all the money and status except emptiness. That maybe he'd become a person even he couldn't respect. And as he walked out onto the street, clutching the envelope with $2,000 and a bank card, James Crawford faced a night of absolute uncertainty for the first time in his life. Tomorrow he was supposed to pick people up and drive them places and pretend to be something he'd never been. Useful. He had no idea how to do that. He had no idea if he was capable of doing that. And standing on that street corner, watching the city move around him, people with purpose, with direction, with actual things that mattered, he had the creeping, terrifying realization that his father's ultimatum wasn't cruelty. It was mercy. Because if nothing changed, if he couldn't find something real underneath all the rot, then maybe he deserved to lose everything. That thought should have terrified him. It did, but it also, in some distant, unfamiliar way, felt like the beginning of something. Not hope. Not yet, but something that might, eventually, become hope. Tomorrow morning at 6, James Crawford would sit behind the wheel of a rideshare vehicle and become a driver for people. He didn't know it yet, but his entire life was about to be rewritten by a single passenger, by a girl who'd been invisible her whole life, by someone who'd learned all the lessons he was just beginning to need. The countdown was on, and everything was about to change. The Airbnb room in Jackson Heights, Queens, was a studio apartment above a bodega, and it smelled like decades of other people's dinners. Fried onions, curry, stale cooking oil, the kind of smell that gets into the walls and decides to stay, like it owns the place. James stood in the center of the room at 11:47 p.m., staring at the twin bed with the questionable floral comforter, the mini-fridge that hummed like a dying animal, and the single window that looked out onto a fire escape in the back of another building. This was real estate that probably cost about $40 per square foot. He'd once bought a pair of shoes more expensive than the entire annual rent on this place. He sat on the bed, it creaked in protest, and pulled out his phone. 43 missed messages. His usual crew of friends, people he'd known since childhood, people who existed in a world that felt very far away now. They were at clubs, someone's parents' beach house, a party somewhere in Tribeca. The world kept turning without him, and somehow that was the most unsettling realization of all. He could call someone. He could explain that this was all a misunderstanding, that his parents had had some sort of shared psychotic episode, that he'd be back in the penthouse by the end of the week. His friends would believe it. They'd make room for him at whatever fancy restaurant they were hitting next. The machinery of his old life would grind back into motion. But his father's words kept echoing. I still believe you're capable of being someone worth knowing. I just need you to believe it too. James set the phone down without making any calls. Instead, he lay back on the creaking bed and stared at the water stain on the ceiling. Somewhere in the building, someone was playing loud music. Salsa, maybe, or reggaeton. He wasn't sure. He'd never really paid attention to music that didn't come through high-end speakers at parties he was throwing. Sleep didn't come until close to 3 in the morning, and it was the kind of sleep that doesn't actually rest. You just drags you through a series of anxious dreams where he was falling, over and over, and never quite hit the ground. At 5:33 a.m., James's eyes snapped open. He'd set an alarm for 5:45. His body somehow knew he was supposed to be awake before that. In the dark of the Queen's studio, with the city just beginning to murmur into wakefulness around him, he lay in the dark and understood something essential. His body was responding to genuine fear. For the first time in his life, there were actual consequences waiting for him, and his nervous system knew it. He was out of bed by 5:45, showered in a bathroom that was barely larger than a closet, dressed in jeans and a plain t-shirt, not designer, not brand name, just clothes from a normal store that probably cost less than $30. He looked in the mirror and didn't recognize himself. Not because his face was different, but because the context was different. Without the penthouse behind him, without the tailored clothes and the styled hair, he looked like just another guy. Younger, maybe, more lost. The rideshare car was waiting for him at the agency office in Long Island City. It was a Toyota Camry, maybe 4 years old, with 87,000 miles on the odometer. The previous driver had left receipts and coffee cup rings and the faint smell of something that might have been air freshener or might have been desperation. The dispatcher, a middle-aged woman named Paula with painted-on eyebrows and nails, that could double as weapons, handed him the keys like she was handing him a live grenade. You signed all the paperwork? She asked. Yeah, James said. You got insurance? Registration? You're not going to cause me problems? I'm not going to cause you problems. Paula studied him with an expression that suggested she'd seen every type of problem a rideshare driver could possibly cause. First time driving for someone? That obvious? You look like you're about to throw up, she said. That's usually the tell. She wasn't wrong. His stomach had been churning since he woke up. Not the usual churning of a hangover, but something deeper. The kind of nausea that comes from genuine uncertainty. Just be polite to the passengers, Paula continued. Keep the car clean. Don't drive like an asshole. Don't accept cash payments. Everything goes through the app. Don't let passengers eat in the car. And for the love of God, don't get into any arguments with anybody about politics or religion or anything else. You're a professional. Act like one. I got it, James said. He didn't got it. But he wasn't going to tell her that. The first hour was slow. He drove around Long Island City, seeing the city wake up. People emerging from apartment buildings, stepping onto streets, heading toward jobs and responsibilities and lives that actually meant something. He watched a woman help her elderly mother into a crosswalk. A young guy with a backpack jogged past, earbuds in, probably heading to school or work or both. A small moment of normalcy. A small moment of people who belonged. In the world, in a way, James suddenly felt he didn't. His first ping came at 7:42 a.m., a pickup request from a woman named Patricia, location given as a residential street in Astoria, just about 15 minutes away. James accepted the request with trembling fingers and began driving. The app told him how long until he arrived. 5 minutes, His heart was racing as if he was about to defuse a bomb. When he pulled up to the address, an older woman was waiting on the curb wearing hospital scrubs with 2 large coffees and what looked like a work bag. She took one look at him and smiled. "You're very young," she said, getting into the back seat. "First day," James admitted. "Oh, that explains the terrified expression," she said kindly. "I'm Patricia. I work at the hospital. The address in the app is the Hospital St. Joseph's over in Manhattan. You know the way?" "Yeah," James said. It was the most dishonest thing he'd said since he started the job. He absolutely knew the way, but mostly because he'd been all over the city his entire life, never paying attention to how anything worked, just showing up where he wanted to be. The conversation died as they drove. Patricia seemed content to sit quietly, sipping her coffee, looking out the window. James drove carefully, deliberately, hyper-aware of every movement he made. He was terrified of doing something wrong, of making a mistake, of confirming that he was exactly as useless as he'd begun to suspect. At a red light, Patricia leaned forward slightly. "You okay, honey? You look like you're about to drive us off a bridge." "I'm fine," James said. "Just want to make sure I do a good job." "Well, you're driving smoothly and you're not playing garbage music, so you're already winning," she said. "Can I give you some advice?" "Sure." "Stop being so afraid," she said. "Fear makes you tight. When you're tight, you make mistakes. Just relax. You're driving a car. Millions of people do it every day and don't die. You're going to be fine." There was something about her casual kindness that actually helped. When they arrived at the hospital, James pulled up to the main entrance with only slightly trembling hands. Patricia got out, and before she closed the door, she leaned back in. "You're going to do great," she said. "I can tell. You've got that look like you're actually trying. That counts for something." She closed the door and walked into the hospital, and James sat in the pickup lane for a moment, feeling something shift inside him. It was a small thing, just a woman telling him he was going to be okay. But it was the first time in 24 hours that he'd felt like someone believed in him. And that tiny seed of belief was enough to make him think maybe he could actually do this. The next 6 hours were a blur of pickups and drop-offs. A construction worker heading to a job site in Brooklyn. A college student going to class. An elderly man going to his cardiologist. A woman with 3 kids heading to a summer camp. A businessman checking his phone the entire ride, muttering about conference calls. An artist carrying a portfolio of paintings. A nurse heading home after a 12-hour shift who fell asleep in the back seat and only woke up when James gently said, "We're here." Each ride was maybe 15 minutes long. Each one was a small conversation. Most people didn't say much beyond giving directions and thanking him when they left. But James began to notice things. The way some people looked at him really looked at him with gratitude, as if his simply being there, being safe to ride with, was somehow meaningful to them. The care he heard in people's voices when they asked if he knew the route, or if they'd have time to make it to their destination. By noon, he'd completed 23 rides and made about $140. For someone who usually spent that much on lunch without thinking about it, it was a strange feeling. Tiny, but significant. Like picking up coins off the street and realizing you are actually accumulating something real. He decided to take a break. He drove to a park, bought a sandwich from a bodega for $7, actually choosing the cheapest option because the money felt like it actually belonged to him, and sat in the car eating it, scrolling through his phone. More messages from friends. More invitations to things he used to think mattered. And messages from his mother. Your father said you made it through the first day. I'm proud of you. Love, Mom. That one sentence did something to him, made his throat tight, made him realize that somewhere underneath all the disappointment and anger, his parents still believed he was salvageable, still believed he was their son. At 1:17 p.m., his phone pinged with another pickup request. This one was different from the others, though he wouldn't understand why until he saw her. The location was a homeless shelter in Washington Heights. The Ramit, name attached to the account, was Riley. James accepted the request and began driving north, toward a part of the city he rarely visited. He didn't think much about it. Just another ride. Just another person heading somewhere. He had no idea that the entire architecture of his life was about to reorganize itself around a single moment. He had no idea that in about 20 minutes he was going to pick up a 20-year-old girl named Riley, who would look at him and see not a rich kid, not a failed son, not a beautiful disaster. She would just see a person trying. And sometimes that's all it takes to change everything. When James pulled up to the shelter at 1:41 p.m. on that ordinary Tuesday afternoon, he had no idea that his whole existence was about to be turned inside out. No idea that the passenger he was about to meet had her own story, her own struggles, her own reasons for needing someone to believe in her the way his father had tried to believe in him. He pulled to the curb and waited, and then she walked out of the building, and the world shifted on its axis. Her name was Riley, but that's about all she had in common with the name. Most Rileys, James imagined, came from somewhere, had backgrounds, had families waiting for them at home. Riley looked like she'd been assembled from the leftover pieces of other people's luck. She was 20 years old, which he'd know from the app, but she looked simultaneously younger and older than the kind of age you get when you've lived harder than most people do in 30 years. Her hair was dark brown, pulled back in a messy bun, and there was a streak of something that might have been intentional blonde or maybe just sun-faded running through it. She wore jeans that had been mended in multiple places and a shirt that said Harbor Diner across the front, which was probably a place she'd worked or was going to work or had dreamed of working. But it was her face that stopped James's thoughts. Mid-sentence. She wasn't conventionally beautiful, not the way the girls he usually surrounded himself with were beautiful, filtered, polished, designed by expensive dermatologists and personal trainers. Riley's beauty was different. It was the kind that came from actual living. There were faint freckles across her nose, like someone had flicked paint across her skin. Her eyes were green, but not the bright, clear green of someone who'd spent their life looking at horizons. These were the eyes of someone who'd looked at things most people pretended not to see. She got in the back seat and closed the door, and James caught her scent, something like soap and laundry detergent, and just underneath that, the faint smell of survival. The smell of someone who'd learned to keep themselves together, even when the world was trying to fall apart around them. "Hey," she said. Her voice was quiet, but not uncertain. It was the kind of quiet that came from someone who'd learned that taking up too much space got you hurt. "Hey," James replied. He turned to look at her through the mirror. "Where are we?" "Headed? Battery Park," she said. "I have a job interview at 4 o'clock. Is that okay? Can you take me there?" "Yeah, of course. That's about 40 minutes from here, depending on traffic." She nodded and settled back into the seat, and James started driving without saying anything else. He'd picked up enough people to know that not everyone wanted to talk. Some passengers just wanted to sit quietly with their own thoughts, and that was fine. But as he drove, navigating through the afternoon traffic of Washington Heights, something made him glance at her. In the mirror again. She was staring out the window, and her lips were moving slightly. She was either talking to herself or maybe praying. Her fingers were twisted together in her lap, and he could see the white of her knuckles. "You nervous?" he asked. She looked up, startled, as if she'd forgotten he was there. "About the interview?" "Yeah." She took a breath. "Terrified," she said. And something about the honesty of it struck James. She could have lied, could have said something brave and dismissive. Instead, she'd just admitted the truth. "What's the job?" he asked. "Front desk at a hotel," she said. "The Harbor View Inn. It's not fancy or anything, but they have good benefits, and they give you full-time hours if you work out. And I need—" She trailed off, reconsidering what she was about to say. "You need something?" James prompted. "I need to not be living in a shelter anymore," she said simply. "That's the thing I need. I know that's probably weird to talk about with a stranger, but I'm kind of done pretending things are fine when they're not." There was something in that statement that hit James directly in the chest, because it was exactly what his father had been trying to tell him. Stop pretending. Just tell the truth about where you are. "How long?" he asked. "At the shelter?" 3 months, she said. She was looking at him now, really looking at him, as if trying to decide if he was the type of person who would judge her. "Before that, I was sleeping in my car for about 2 months. Before that, I was living with my mom in an apartment in the Bronx, but she has a problem. Substance thing. And I couldn't—" She stopped, shook her head. "I'm sorry. You probably don't want to hear all this." But James did want to hear it, more than he'd wanted to hear anything in a long time. Because her story, this constellation of bad luck and bad timing and the kind of survival that doesn't make headlines, was more real than anything he'd experienced in his entire life. "I want to hear it," he said. She studied him for a moment, trying to figure out if he was serious. Then she seemed to decide that it didn't really matter. What was the worst that could happen? She was already living in a shelter. She was already terrified. What was one more person knowing her truth? "My mom got really into painkillers after a car accident about 5 years ago," Riley said, her voice steady even though her hands were still twisted together. "Started with prescribed stuff, but then it became other stuff. I tried to help her, tried to get her into programs, tried everything, but you can't help someone who doesn't want to be helped. Eventually, I realized I was drowning with her, so I left. Got a job at a McDonald's, tried to save for an apartment. But it turns out minimum wage doesn't really stretch that far in New York. And when my car broke down, when I couldn't afford to fix it, everything kind of collapsed." She paused, looking out the window at the city moving past. "The shelter's not the worst place. I have a cot and a locker and access to showers. There's a woman who works there, Miss Deborah, and she's been helping me get my resume together, helping me figure out how to get my life back on track. She's the one who told me about this job interview. So," she shrugged, "here I am, terrified, but here." James felt something crystallize inside him. Some understanding that had been forming but not yet real. He looked at this girl, this stranger, who was braver than he'd ever been, and he understood what his father had been trying to teach him. It wasn't about the money. It wasn't about the penthouse or the cars or the status. It was about this, about the difference between people who had actual stakes in the world and people who'd never had to risk anything real. "You're going to get the job," James said. "You don't know that," Riley said, but she was smiling slightly. "You don't even know me." "I know you're honest," James said. "I know you didn't make excuses. I know you're still trying even though things have been terrible. People can tell that about a person. Whoever interviews you is going to be able to tell that you actually care about doing the work." Riley looked at him with an expression that was hard to read, a mixture of gratitude and skepticism, like she wanted to believe him but had learned not to. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for listening, for not making it weird." "Why would it be weird?" "Because, I don't know. Rich people usually find me weird. I can always tell when they're uncomfortable around me, like poverty is contagious." The words landed on James, and he felt something like shame. Not the shame of having had money, but the shame of not having used his empathy enough to bridge the gap between himself and people like her. How many times had he been in rooms with people who were struggling, and he just hadn't noticed them? How many times had someone's real desperation been playing out right in front of him while he thought about something completely trivial? "I'm not that kind of rich person," he said. "Oh yeah? What kind are you?" "The kind that's figuring it out," he said. "The kind that maybe shouldn't be." Traffic started moving again, and James accelerated smoothly through the lanes. They drove, in silence for a while, but it wasn't the uncomfortable silence of before. It was the kind of silence where two people were sitting next to each other and just existing. "Can I ask you something?" Riley said eventually. "Yeah. Why did you become a driver? You seem like you could probably do a lot of other things." The question should have been easy to deflect. He could have made something up, could have said he was saving money for school or just liked meeting people or any number of easy lies. But something about Riley's honesty had created a space where lies didn't work. "My dad made me," he said, "kind of as a punishment. I was being a terrible person, and he wanted me to see how other people actually lived, how the world actually works outside of my little bubble." "Is it working?" she asked. "Yeah," James said. "I think it might be." Riley smiled, and it was the first genuine smile he'd seen from her. It transformed her entire face, made her look younger and more hopeful all at once. "Then your dad's smarter than most parents," she said. They pulled up to Battery Park 40 minutes later. The sun was starting to dip lower in the sky, and the light had that golden quality that made everything look a little bit like a movie. Riley gathered her bag, a worn backpack that had probably been through as much as she had. "You're going to crush this interview," James said, as she was getting out. "Thank you," she said. "And thank you for listening, for not making me feel like I was oversharing or whatever." "You weren't," he said. "You were just being real. There's nothing wrong with that." She closed the door, and James watched her walk toward the hotel, her shoulders a little bit straighter than they'd been before. She had the kind of posture that came from making a decision, from choosing to believe she was capable of good things, even when the world had given her very few reasons to believe that. After she disappeared into the hotel, James sat in the driver's seat, staring at nothing in particular. The app showed him that the ride had generated $43 in fare and tip combined. Normally, he wouldn't have even noticed the tip, but Riley had left him $5 and a comment that said, "Amazing driver. Made me feel like things are going to be okay." James read that comment 5 times before he understood what it meant. He'd helped someone feel hope. Not because he was rich, not because he had connections or influence, but simply because he'd listened, because he'd treated her like a person instead of a problem to be solved. His phone buzzed, another pickup request, then another. The city kept moving, and there were other people who needed to get somewhere, other stories waiting to be collected. But as James accepted the next ride and began navigating back through the traffic, something had shifted inside him. The shallow thing that had been his chest his whole life was beginning to develop actual weight, actual substance, actual meaning. He didn't know it yet, But Riley wasn't going to leave his life after that ride. He didn't know it. But by the time this week was over, his entire understanding of what mattered would have been completely rewritten. He didn't know that she was currently sitting in a hotel office, doing the interview of her life, thinking about how a stranger driver had told her she was going to get the job, that she was going to say something in that interview about how she'd been helped by someone who believed in her, that somehow, impossibly, that conversation was going to ripple outward in ways neither of them could predict. He just knew that for the first time in his life, James Crawford had done something that actually mattered, and he was beginning to understand that that feeling, that sense of genuine purpose, might be worth more than everything else he'd ever had combined. The city moved around him as he drove. The evening deepened into night. And somewhere in Battery Park, a girl with impossibly strong shoulders was walking out of a hotel, checking her phone, and making a decision that would change everything. James didn't expect to see Riley again. That night, after his shift ended at 9 o'clock, and he returned the Camry to the agency lot, he thought about her the way you think about people you pass on the street, a moment of genuine connection that evaporates once the moment is over. He went back to the studio apartment in Queens, microwaved a frozen dinner that cost $4, and lay in bed scrolling through his phone, $187.43. That was what he'd made in his first day as a driver. $187. He'd spent that much on breakfast before. He'd spent that much on concert tickets he barely remembered. But now, staring at that number on the app, he felt something like genuine accomplishment. He'd worked for that money. He'd helped people get where they needed to go. He'd made a stranger feel like things might be okay. His mother had texted, "Your father told me you came home to the right place. Not the penthouse, home. That means something. I'm so proud of you, sweetheart." His father had also texted, which was unusual. "How was day one?" James replied. "Different than I expected. I'll tell you about it when I see you." He didn't mention Riley. He wasn't sure why. Maybe because talking about her would make her real in a different way. Maybe because he was afraid his father would read too much into it. Maybe because he was already thinking about her too much, and admitting it to his father felt like admitting something about himself he wasn't ready to face. He fell asleep around midnight and woke at 5:30 a.m. without setting an alarm. His body was adjusting to the rhythm of work. His mind understood that there were people depending on him now, even if they didn't know it, even if they were just strangers passing through his car for 30 minutes or an hour. The second day followed much the same pattern as the first. Different passengers, different destinations, the slow accumulation of small human moments. An accountant talking about her sick daughter. A musician heading to a studio session. An elderly couple heading to the airport for their 50th wedding anniversary trip. Each ride was a window into someone else's life. Each one carved away a little bit more of James's certainty that his own existence was the most important thing in the world. By 3 o'clock in the afternoon, he'd made about $140. The sun was bright and hot, and he was considering taking another break when his phone pinged with a pickup request. The location was a hospital. The passenger name was Riley. James's heart did something strange. Not a normal beat, but a catch, like a drum skipping a measure. He accepted immediately, perhaps too quickly, and began navigating toward the hospital without overthinking it. When he pulled up to the main entrance of St. Joseph's Hospital, Riley was sitting on a bench outside, and she looked completely different than she had the day before. Different, but not bad. Different. Better different. She was wearing a blue polo shirt with Harbor Inn embroidered over the left side of her chest, and her hair was down, falling past her shoulders in waves. She was staring at her phone and didn't immediately see the car pull up. James put the car in park and watched her for just a moment. She looked exhausted, but also, somehow, lighter. Like something heavy had been set down. She saw the car, and her head came up, and when she recognized him, her expression shifted completely. Surprise, and then something else. Something that looked a lot like relief. "James?" she said, as she got in the car. He realized she'd probably gotten his name from the app. Of course she had. It wasn't like he was recognizable as anything other than a driver. But hearing his name, in her voice still landed like something significant. "Hey," he said, trying to sound casual. "You got the job?" "I got the job," she confirmed, and her voice had that bright quality of someone still in shock at their own good fortune. I still can't quite believe it. They called me back in an hour to offer me the position. I'm starting Monday. Full-time, benefits after 90 days. And the manager, her name is Catherine. She seems really nice. She asked me in the interview what I wanted from this opportunity. And I told her I wanted to prove I could be reliable. That I wanted people to be able to count on me. And she said that's exactly what they needed. She was talking fast, words tumbling over each other like she'd been holding them inside and just needed to let them out. James felt something expand in his chest. A sense of pride that wasn't even his to feel. But he felt it anyway. "I knew it," he said. "I told you that you would?" "You did," she said, and she was smiling. "And now I'm sitting in your car, and it feels like maybe things are actually turning around. Like maybe the universe isn't completely against me." She paused, studying his face. "This is weird, right? You're like my good luck charm or something. The universe sent me a rideshare driver who believed in me." "Where are we headed?" James asked, though he didn't want to move. He wanted to sit in this parking lot forever, in this moment where Riley was happy and everything felt possible. "I'm actually heading to the shelter," she said. "I need to pack up my stuff. My social worker found me a transitional housing program. It's in Jackson Heights. Actually not that far from where you're living. I move in tomorrow. It's temporary. I can stay for 6 months while I get settled, but it's not the shelter. It's an actual apartment. A room of my own." "That's incredible," James said, and he meant it. He understood the significance of what she was saying. An apartment meant stability. It meant the beginning of a future. But as he pulled away from the hospital and began driving toward the shelter, he felt something else settling in underneath the happiness. A complication. A problem he hadn't anticipated. "Can I ask you something?" Riley said as they drove through the afternoon traffic. "Yeah, anything." "Why are you really doing this?" she asked. "Driving for rideshare? Because honestly, you don't seem like someone who needs the money. You seem like, I don't know. You seem like someone who comes from money, you know? Like it's just there in the way you carry yourself, even though you're trying to hide it." The question was perfectly, devastatingly accurate. And James realized he had a choice in that moment. He could lie. He could construct some narrative that made sense and was easier to tell. Or he could do what Riley had done with him. He could just tell the truth. "My dad made me do this," he said. "As punishment. I was being a terrible person, rich kid, with no awareness of how the world actually works. Entitled, selfish. All of it. I got someone hurt. Someone really hurt. And my parents basically cut me off and said if I wanted to be part of the family again, I needed to work as a driver for a week and actually see how other people live." He waited for her to respond with judgment or skepticism. Instead, she was quiet for a moment. "That's actually really smart parenting," she said finally. "That's the kind of thing that could actually change someone, if they let it." "Is it changing me?" he asked. "Yeah," she said. "I can tell. Yesterday you listened to me without making it weird. You treated me like a person. Today you're still being kind, but now you're also genuinely happy about my good news. That's not fake. You're actually becoming someone who gives a shit about other people. That's a big change from someone who was causing hurt." They drove in silence for a while, and James thought about what she'd said. She was right. Something was shifting inside him, not in the dramatic, movie moment kind of way, but in the slow, steady way that real change happens. Every conversation was teaching him something. Every story he heard was expanding the walls of his understanding. "Can I tell you something?" Riley said. "Something I haven't told anyone?" "Yeah, I'm really scared," she said quietly. "About the job, about the apartment, about all of it. Because what if I screw it up? What if I get there and I'm not good enough, or I make mistakes, or something happens and I end up back in the shelter? What if this is just a moment of good luck that's about to crash?" "It won't," James said. "You don't know that." "I do," he said, "because I've seen you. I've watched you work, watched you interview, listened to you talk about your life. You're not someone who screws things up. You're someone who keeps going even when everything is against you. That doesn't just stop happening because you get lucky. That's who you are." When they pulled up to the shelter, Riley didn't immediately get out of the car. She sat there for a moment, and James could see her shoulders shaking slightly. "Are you okay?" he asked. "Yeah," she said, and her voice was thick with emotion. "I'm just... No one talks to me like that. Like I'm worth believing in. Like my life matters, and you're a stranger, and you barely know me. But you're saying these things like you actually mean them. And it's making me realize how badly I've been underestimating myself." She reached forward and squeezed his shoulder, and James felt that touch like an electric current running through him. There was something happening here that was bigger than a driver and a passenger. There was something real taking root. "Thank you," she said, "for everything. For listening yesterday. For believing I could get the job. For just being kind to me when the world hasn't really given me reasons to expect kindness from anyone." "You're going to be amazing," James said. "At the job, at the apartment, at life. You're going to be amazing. And I'm going to watch it happen." She smiled and got out of the car, and as she walked toward the shelter, James realized something that should have terrified him, but instead just felt like truth. He was falling for her. Not because she was beautiful, though she was. Not because she was interesting, though she absolutely was. But because she was real. Because she looked at the world with clear eyes and kept choosing to believe that things could get better. Because she was braver than anyone he'd ever met. And she didn't even seem to know it. He stayed in the shelter parking lot for about 5 minutes after she disappeared inside, just sitting with the reality of what was happening. His father had sent him out into the world to learn responsibility. What he hadn't anticipated was that James would learn it by falling for someone who had more strength in her little finger than he had in his entire body. That night, lying in his bed in the Jackson Heights apartment, staring at the water stain on the ceiling, James did something he'd never really done before. He thought about another person's future more than his own. He thought about Riley in an apartment of her own. Riley learning the job at the Harbor Inn. Riley continuing to build the life she was fighting so hard to create. And he understood, with a clarity that was almost painful, that his job as a driver wasn't just about making money or learning responsibility. It was about becoming someone worth standing beside someone like her. Because Riley deserved better than A version of James that hadn't changed? She deserved the real version, the honest version, the one that was still becoming, but was actually trying to become something good. The week continued in its strange, revelatory rhythm. Wednesday brought a contractor heading to a job site who talked about his daughter's college fund. Thursday brought a nurse coming off a night shift who fell asleep with her forehead against the window. Friday brought an older woman who reminded James of his mother, who asked if he had people who loved him, and seemed genuinely relieved when he said yes. Each day, James made somewhere between $120 and $180. Each day, he set most of it aside. He ate minimally, spent carefully, and watched his balance grow. By Friday evening, he had just over $900. More than he'd ever earned, less than he'd ever valued anything before this week. But Friday night, something shifted. James was heading back to the agency office to return the car when his personal phone, not the rideshare app, buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Hey, it's Riley. Got your number from the app registration. I hope that's not creepy. Wanted to say thank you again and also wanted to invite you to something tomorrow. There's a community center not far from my new apartment. They're having a summer party thing. Free food, music, games, totally casual. I'll be there with my social worker, Miss Deborah, and a few other people from the program. If you want to come, no pressure. Just thought I'd ask." James read the message 5 times, feeling something oscillate between joy and terror. She'd initiated contact. She wanted to see him outside of the rideshare context. This was no longer just a transaction. This was someone reaching out to someone else. This was the beginning of something he couldn't take back. He responded, "I'll be there. What time? What's the address?" The response came immediately. 7 p.m. I'll text you the location. And James, I'm really glad you're coming. That night, James barely slept. He lay in the dark and thought about what it meant that he cared about someone now. Really cared. Not in the superficial way he'd cared about things before, but in the way that made your stomach hurt when you thought about them getting hurt. In the way that made you want to be better, just so you'd be worthy of their presence. Saturday morning, he took a shower and stood in front of the mirror for a long time, trying to figure out who he was looking at. The face was the same. The bone, structure, the features, the basic architecture of James Crawford was unchanged. But something in the eyes was different. There was clarity there now. Purpose. The look of someone beginning to become real. He spent the afternoon working, made good money, helped people. And all the while he was watching the time, waiting for 7 p.m. to arrive. At 6:45, he headed to the community center. It was a brick building in a neighborhood that didn't have much, but the people there had clearly made the most of it. There was bunting strung between the trees. Someone had set up a grill. The sound of reggaeton was playing from a speaker, and people were already dancing on the small patio area. And there was Riley. She was wearing a sundress yellow, with little white flowers on it, and her hair was in a braid down her back. She was laughing at something her social worker, Miss Deborah, had said. She looked happy. Actually, genuinely happy in a way that seemed to light up everything around her. She saw him, and her face transformed completely. She excused herself from the conversation and walked over, and without asking or hesitating, she hugged him. It wasn't a polite hug, it was a real one, a full-bodied, genuine expression of affection. "You came?" she said. "I wasn't sure if you would. I wasn't sure if I was pushing too hard or being weird or something." "You weren't," James said. "I wanted to come." "Come meet Miss Deborah," Riley said, pulling him over. "Miss Deborah, this is James. James, this is Miss Deborah. She's the one who's been helping me get my life together." Miss Deborah was a woman in her 60s, with sharp eyes that seemed to see everything. She shook James's hand firmly. "Riley speaks very highly of you," Miss Deborah said, studying him in a way that made James feel like she was reading his entire history. "She says you gave her hope when she needed it." "She did that herself," James said. "I just listened." "Sometimes listening is everything," Miss Deborah said. She squeezed Riley's shoulder. "I'm going to get some food. You two go enjoy yourselves." They spent the next few hours together in a way that felt almost dreamlike. They ate, they danced, not in a formal way, just moving to the music, laughing when they got out of sync. They sat on a bench and talked about everything and nothing. Riley told him about her new apartment, small, clean, with a window that looked out onto a fire escape and the back of another building. James found himself smiling at that detail, at how Riley's life mirrored so much of his own experience in that tiny studio, and yet somehow she'd transformed it into something to be grateful for. "I move in tomorrow," she said. "The shelter is packing up my stuff tonight. And on Monday, I start the job. Job, real apartment, real life. I still can't quite believe it's happening." "You deserve it," James said. "I know I do now," she said. "That's new for me. Actually believing I deserve good things. It's because of you, you know. Because you treated me like I was worth treating well, and it made me start to believe it too." James felt his chest tighten. He wanted to tell her then. Wanted to tell her that he was falling for her, that the week was almost over, and he didn't know what was going to happen next. That the only thing that mattered to him now was making sure she got everything she deserved. But before he could say anything, his phone buzzed. A call from his father. He should have let it go to voicemail, should have ignored it. But something in his gut told him this was important. "I'm sorry," he said to Riley. "I need to take this." He walked to the edge of the party, away from the noise, and answered. "James," his father said, and his voice sounded strange. Not angry, worried. "Dad, is everything okay? Is Mom okay?" "Your mother is fine," Richard said. "But we need to talk about something, and I'm not going to sugarcoat it. One of the young men you drove into the river on Tuesday, the passenger in the vehicle, he's pressing charges. Against you. Against the company that owns the car. His lawyer contacted our lawyers this afternoon. He's claiming significant injuries, spinal damage. He's seeking damages. This is serious, James. This is more serious than anything you've done before." The world seemed to tilt. James sat down on a bench that was mercifully away from the party. "What does that mean?" he asked, though he was pretty sure he knew. "It means that if this goes to court, you could be facing significant legal consequences. It also means that I need to tell you something. Your mother and I have decided to bring in our legal team. We're going to fight this, but we need your cooperation, full cooperation, complete honesty. We need you to come home. Tonight. We need to prepare you for what's coming." James looked back toward the party. Riley was dancing with Miss Deborah, moving to the music, completely unaware that his entire world was about to shift again. "Dad, I can't come home yet," he said. "The week isn't over." "The week is irrelevant now, James. There are legal implications here. There's someone who was hurt, and they're demanding accountability. This is the real world now. This is what happens when actions have consequences." "I know," James said quietly. "I'm starting to understand that. Then come home. We need to figure this out together. We need lawyers. We need strategy. We need you." After they hung up, James sat in the dark for a long time. He understood what was happening. This was the twist. This was the moment when everything that had been going right started to unravel. His father had sent him out to learn responsibility, and responsibility was arriving at his door in the form of legal action, in the form of someone whose life he'd endangered now demanding justice. He walked back into the party, and Riley immediately moved toward him. She took one look at his face, and her expression changed. "What's wrong?" she asked. And James realized he had a choice. He could lie. He could pretend everything was fine and let her continue believing he was this good person, this driver who'd helped her find hope. Or he could do what they'd been doing all week. Tell the truth. "My dad just called," he said. "The person I drove into the river the night before I met you, he's pressing charges. Serious ones. I might be facing legal consequences, real ones, not the kind I can just pay off." Riley's face went through several expressions: surprise, concern, and then something else. Processing. Understanding. "What does that mean?" she asked quietly. "It means I don't know what comes next," he said. "It means everything I've been learning this week about being a better person is about to be tested in a way I wasn't prepared for. It means I might have to go back home, let my parents help me deal with this legally. And I don't know when I'll see you again." "Oh," Riley said, and that single word carried so much weight. The sound of someone realizing that something good was ending before it fully began. "I'm sorry," James said. "I'm sorry that I'm walking into your life, and already bringing complications." "You're not walking into my life with complications," she said. "You're walking into my life as someone who's actually trying to be better. And that's real. That's not going to change just because you're dealing with consequences of your past. Actually, it's going to make it more real. Because anyone can be good when there's nothing on the line. But you're going to try to be good even when you're facing legal trouble. That says something." "I don't want to lose you," James said. "I don't even have the right to say that, because I've only known you for a few days. But I don't want to." Riley reached out and took his hand. "You're not going to lose me," she said. "But you need to go. Handle this. You need to be honest with your lawyers. You need to make sure whoever you hurt gets what they need. That's the person you're becoming, James. That's the person I believe in. So go. Handle it. And then come find me when you can. It might take a while," he said. "Then it takes a while," she said. "I'm not going anywhere. Not now that I have my apartment and my job. I'm finally in one place. So you can take the time you need to figure this out." He left the party that night and drove back to the studio apartment in Queens. He packed the few things he owned into a backpack. He returned the Camry to the agency and sent Paula a message saying he'd have to take a leave of absence due to family matters. By midnight, he was in a car his father had sent, heading back to the penthouse, heading back to the old world, heading into territory where the new lessons he'd learned would have to be tested in fire. The week was over. The real work was just beginning. The penthouse felt different when James returned to it. Larger, but somehow smaller. More hollow. The same furniture, the same art, the same view of the city. But now it felt like a museum he was visiting rather than a home he lived in. The air was still polished, but it smelled like something he'd outgrown. His mother was waiting for him. She was sitting in the living room, still dressed even though it was after midnight, like she'd been waiting up for him to come home from a bad dream. When she saw him, her face crumpled with a complex mix of emotions: relief, worry, and something that looked like regret. "Oh, baby," she said, and she pulled him into an embrace that was so genuine, so maternal, that James felt something break open inside his chest. He'd been gone for 5 days. 5 days. And somehow, the absence had made him feel the weight of his mother's love in a way he'd never felt it before. "I'm sorry," he said into her shoulder. "I'm sorry for everything. I'm sorry for being awful. I'm sorry for putting you through this." "Shh," she said. "We can talk about apologies later. Right now, I just need you to understand how serious this is." The young man in the car, his name is Derek Paulson. He's 24 years old. He's an accountant. And according to his medical reports, your driving damaged his spinal cord. There's a possibility of partial paralysis. He might not ever regain full mobility. The words landed on James like a physical blow. Not partial. Not maybe. Possibly. A person. A real person with a name and a job, and probably dreams, and people who loved him, might never walk the same way again because of something James had done in a drug-fueled moment of thoughtlessness. "Where is he now?" James asked. "In a rehabilitation facility in New Jersey," his mother said. "The lawyers have advised against any contact, but—" "I need to see him," James said. "James, that's not a good idea. Anything you say could be used against you in court." "I don't care," he said. "He deserves to know that I'm not just hiding in a penthouse, waiting for lawyers to make this go away. He deserves to look me in the face and know that I understand what I did, that I'm not going to pretend it didn't happen." His father appeared from the hallway. He was still wearing his work clothes from the day before, which meant he probably hadn't slept at all. His face looked hollowed out by worry. "Your mother is right," Richard said. "The legal strategy is to—" "I don't care about legal strategy," James interrupted. "I care about Derek Paulson. I did something that might have ruined his life, and if I can't even face him, then what am I? What's any of this worth?" Richard looked at his son for a long moment, and James saw something shift in his father's expression. Recognition, maybe, or confirmation that the change he'd been trying to force into James was actually real. "Okay," Richard said. "Okay, tomorrow morning. We'll go together. But you don't say anything without running it by me first, understood?" The next morning, they drove to the rehabilitation facility in New Jersey. James sat in the back seat of the car while his father drove, and the entire time, he was thinking about what he would say. How do you apologize to someone whose life you've derailed? What words exist for that kind of harm? Derek Paulson was in a room with light streaming through the windows. He was sitting in a wheelchair, doing physical therapy, his legs stretched out as a therapist guided it through gentle movements. When he saw Richard and James walk in, his expression went through several transformations. First confusion, then anger, then something harder to read. Resignation, maybe. The look of someone who'd learned that fairness didn't actually exist in the world. "I'm James Crawford," James said, stepping forward. "I'm the person who drove the car that hit you." "I know who you are," Derek said. His voice was quiet, but edged with something sharp. "Your lawyers have made it very clear. They've sent me enough paperwork to fill a library. I'm told you're rich and young and very sorry about the whole situation. I'm not going to talk about the legal stuff," James said. He could feel his father's presence behind him, feel the warning in that silence. But he pressed forward anyway. "I'm here to tell you what I should have done already. I hurt you. Seriously. Possibly permanently. And I was too stupid and self-absorbed to even process that, to even understand the reality of what I'd done to another person." "Do you understand it now?" Derek asked. There was a challenge in his voice, a test. "I'm starting to," James said. I spent a week driving for rideshare because my father forced me to. And I met someone who's been homeless, who's been living in her car, who's trying to rebuild her life from nothing. And when I was with her, when I was driving people around and hearing their stories, I started to understand that my life, my stupid, easy, thoughtless life, had never actually mattered to anybody. But hers did. Every moment of her life, every choice she made, it meant something. And then I realized what I did to you, and I understand that I took something that mattered. I took your certainty that you'd be okay. I took your mobility. I took time from you that you're never getting back. Derek's expression shifted slightly. Not forgiveness, James wasn't stupid enough to expect that. But something like acknowledgement. I don't know what you want from me, Derek said. I don't want anything, James said. I'm not here to make myself feel better or to try to manipulate this situation. I'm here to say that I see you. I see what I did. And I'm going to spend the rest of my life making sure something like this never happens again. Not because the law is forcing me to, but because I actually give a shit now. Because I finally understand that there are real people trying to live real lives, and people like me can either help or hurt. And I choose to help. After they left the facility, James's father was quiet for a long time. They drove back through New Jersey, past strip malls and highways, and the mundane geography of regular life. That took courage, Richard said finally. That took honesty, James said. There's a difference. Courage would be if I was pretending to feel something. Honesty is just telling the truth about how ashamed I am. The legal process that followed was brutal in its own way. It wasn't dramatic. There were no dramatic courtroom moments like in movies. It was depositions and paperwork, and meetings with lawyers who explained the concept of settlements and liability. Derek's lawyers were requesting substantial damages. James's lawyers were trying to negotiate. Numbers were being thrown around $500,000, $1 million, adjustments up and down. James's trust fund was locked, his father had said, until he was 25. But Richard had other money. Money he'd earned. Money he'd set aside. And he used it. Not to hide James's culpability, but to acknowledge it. To say that sometimes people did terrible things, and they had to pay the price. And the question was whether they'd also change. The settlement, when it was finalized, was $750,000, a significant amount, but less than Derek's lawyers had initially demanded. Derek was going to use it for his rehabilitation, for his therapy, for whatever life looked like going forward. And James understood something essential about that number. It wasn't just money. It was a price tag on his carelessness. It was accountability made real and tangible. It was proof that actions actually did have consequences. During all of this, during the legal process, and the settlements, and the depositions, James did something he'd never done before. He lived quietly. He didn't go to clubs. He didn't see his old friends. He didn't spend money. He volunteered at a community center a few days a week, teaching kids basic computer skills, trying in small ways to contribute something good to the world. And he called Riley. Not often, once or twice a week. Quick conversations. He didn't want to distract her from her new life. She'd started her job at the Harbor Inn. She was working the front desk, and she loved it. She talked about guests and reservations and a manager named Catherine, who was mentoring her. She talked about her apartment, which was small but hers. She talked about Miss Deborah, who'd become something like a mentor figure. "How are you doing with everything?" she asked him during one of their calls. "It's hard," he said. "The legal stuff, the guilt, understanding what I actually did." "But you're facing it," she said. "You're not running from it. That matters." "I miss you," he said. "I want to see you." "Then come see me," she said. When you're ready, when the legal stuff is settled. Come see me, James. 2 months after returning to the penthouse, the legal settlement was finalized. Derek had accepted the terms. A structured settlement was being put in place. The charges had been reduced from a felony to a misdemeanor with significant restitution, which was more than James deserved and less than Derek had wanted, which meant it was probably about right. On the day the settlement was signed, James packed a bag. Not much, just the essentials. He walked into his father's study, where Richard was working at his desk. "I'm going to go see Riley," James said. "I'm going back to Queens." Richard looked up from his laptop. There was something in his expression that looked like pride. "How long will you be gone?" he asked. "I don't know," James said. "For as long as it takes. Until I figure out if the person I became in that week as a driver is going to stick around. Until I understand if I can actually be someone different than who I was." "And if you can't?" Richard asked. "Then at least I tried," James said. "At least I faced it. At least I didn't pretend." His father stood up and hugged him. Not like Richard Crawford, successful businessman, but like a father who'd watched his son nearly destroy himself and had forced him to change by letting him walk into fire. "I'm proud of you," Richard said. "I should have said it more often, but I am. I'm very proud of who you're becoming." James took the subway back to Queens. Not a car, not a luxury vehicle. Just the subway, like thousands of other people did every day, heading to places that mattered to them, carrying their lives in their hands and their hope in their hearts. He got off at the Jackson Heights stop and made his way to the address Riley had given him weeks ago. It was a modest building in a modest neighborhood. Nothing fancy. Nothing that would impress anyone who didn't understand the significance of it. But when Riley opened the door, when he saw her face transform from surprise to joy, he understood that he was finally beginning to see what mattered. Not the penthouse, not the money, not the status. Just a girl who'd been invisible, who'd learned to believe in herself, and a boy who'd been spoiled, who'd learned to see. Sometimes, that's all. Love is learning to see each other clearly. Riley's apartment was small. James had expected that. But what he hadn't expected was how much life she'd packed into it. There were plants in the windows, actual living plants that she'd apparently been nurturing. There was a bookshelf with books she was reading. There were photographs tacked to the wall. Miss Deborah smiling at the camera. Riley at her job in her Harbor Inn uniform. A picture of some mountains that Riley said she'd printed because she was saving up to actually go there someday. The walls were painted. A pale yellow, she'd done it herself, she explained, spending the cost of one shift's worth of tips to make the space her own. There were mismatched dishes in the cabinet, collected from thrift stores. There was a used couch that she'd found on the street and cleaned up. Every single thing in that apartment was a choice Riley had made. Every object was an act of intentional self-building. "Welcome to my empire," she said, gesturing around with a smile that was equal parts pride and humor. "It's not a penthouse, but it's mine." "It's perfect," James said, and he meant it absolutely. Because this apartment, with its honest poverty, with its evidence of struggle and perseverance, was worth more to him than the entire penthouse had ever been. This was a space that had been carved out through effort. This was what it looked like. When someone refused to give up, they sat on the couch, which was actually surprisingly comfortable, and just talked for hours. Riley told him everything that had happened in the 2 months since he'd left. She'd gotten raises at work. She was being trained to potentially move into a supervisory role. She'd started taking online classes through a community college program that was free for people in her situation. She was slowly, steadily, methodically building something real. "I'm so proud of you," James said, and he understood that those weren't just words. He actually was. The pride he felt was real and total and overwhelming. "I'm proud of me too," Riley said. "That's new. I never thought I'd say that and mean it. But I do. I'm proud that I didn't give up. I'm proud that I kept showing up." "How's your mom?" James asked carefully. They'd never really talked much about Riley's mother before. Riley's expression became complicated. "I've been trying to help her," she said. "With the money I've been saving, with the resources I've found. There's a rehab program that accepts people without insurance. I've been pushing her to go. She won't. Not yet. But I'm not giving up on her either. I'm accepting that I can't save her. She has to choose to save herself. But I can be here. I can keep being here." James listened to her talk about the complex love of trying to help someone who wasn't ready to be helped. And he thought about Derek Paulson. He thought about accountability. He thought about how some things couldn't be fixed with money or apologies, only with patience and actual change and time. "I'm so different than I was," James said. "Even 2 months ago, I would have been disgusted by this apartment. I would have been thinking about what I could buy you, how I could elevate you into my world. I would have made it about me and my generosity and what I could do for you." "And now?" Riley asked. "Now I get it," he said. "Now I understand that you don't need elevating. You're already doing the work. You're already becoming. My job isn't to rescue you or change you or make your life easier with my money. My job is to just be here, to see you, to believe in you, to maybe make things less hard, but not to make the struggle disappear, because the struggle is what's making you who you are." Riley reached over and took his hand. They sat like that, just holding hands on a thrift store couch in a small apartment in Queens, and James felt something settle into his chest. Not happiness, exactly. Something deeper. Something like rightness. Like finally being exactly where he was supposed to be. That night, Riley made dinner pasta with tomato sauce and vegetables, simple and good, and they ate it sitting on the couch because there was no dining table. They talked about nothing important and everything that mattered. They laughed. They shared things they'd been afraid to admit. "I was scared you wouldn't come back," Riley said. "When you left after the legal thing started, I was terrified that you'd get back into your old world and realize I was just a passenger you'd picked up, that I was just a story that had helped you learn a lesson." "That crossed my mind," James admitted. "Not in a mean way, but in a human way. I had to ask myself if I was real, or if I'd just been playing at being different. And the only way to know was to face the legal stuff, to actually go through it, to prove to myself that the person I was becoming was real." "And is he?" she asked. "Yeah," James said. "He is. I don't know if he's perfect, but he's real. He's someone I can actually respect. Someone you can actually respect." They fell asleep on that couch, tangled together in a way that felt like the most natural thing in the world. And James dreamed of futures that didn't involve penthouses or trust funds or any of the machinery of his old life. He dreamed of working, of building something real, of standing beside Riley as they both continued to become the people they were, meant to be. The next morning, James woke to sunlight streaming through the yellow walls, and Riley was already up, getting ready for work. She moved through the apartment with an efficiency that spoke of routine, of habit, of life being lived intentionally. "Come get coffee with me before I go to work," she asked. They went to a bodega a few blocks away, the same one where James had bought sandwiches during his week as a driver. The owner recognized him. "Hey, my friend," the owner said. "You're still around. Good. Good man." It was such a small thing. But to James, it meant everything. Because he'd been recognized. Not for his money or his status, but for his presence. For showing up. For being part of a community. Even in these small, ordinary ways. Riley headed to work, and James spent the day exploring the neighborhood. Really exploring it. Not looking down at it from some position of temporary slumming, but walking through it, seeing how people actually lived. He found a community center and asked about volunteer opportunities. He walked through parks and stopped to talk to people. He bought lunch from street vendors and struck up conversations with strangers. By the time Riley got home from work, he'd made a decision. "I need to talk to my father," he said. "About money. About what I'm going to do next." "What do you mean?" Riley asked. "I mean, I think I want to do something real," he said. "I don't know exactly what yet. But I know I don't want to go back to my old life. I know I want to actually contribute something. I know I want to be here, in this world, doing something that matters." He called his father that night. And Richard Crawford, who'd been waiting for his son to either crash or prove himself, listened carefully as James explained his thinking. "I want to start a program," James said. "Something for people who are in transitional housing, who've been homeless or are trying to get back on their feet. A job placement program. Something that connects people with employers who understand that everyone deserves a second chance. I want to use part of my money, the money I would have wasted anyway, to actually make a difference." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Tell me more," Richard said finally. They talked for hours, and by the end of the conversation, Richard had offered not just financial support, but connections. Lawyers who could help with the nonprofit paperwork. Contacts at companies who might be interested in hiring people trying to rebuild their lives. His father wasn't just giving James money anymore. He was believing in his son's vision. "I'm proud of you," Richard said again. And this time James understood that it meant something entirely different than it had before. It meant respect. It meant acknowledgement that his son was becoming someone real. Over the next few months, James and Riley built something together. Not just a relationship, though that was deepening every day, but a mission. The program started small, just James, and Riley and Miss Deborah, helping people navigate the space between crisis and stability. They found job placements, they coached interview skills, they connected people with resources, and slowly, quietly, people started to come back and tell them their stories. A woman who'd been homeless who got hired at a hotel and was now training. New employees. A man who'd been living in his car who became a supervisor at a warehouse. A teenager aging out of foster care who got placed in an internship that led to a job. Each story was a tiny revolution. Each person who got back on their feet was proof that second chances actually worked if you believed in them hard enough. By the time James had been away from the penthouse for 6 months, everything had transformed. The program was operating. In 3 neighborhoods, there were grant proposals being written, there were conversations with city officials about scaling it up, and James Crawford, the spoiled, arrogant, thoughtless playboy, had become something he'd never thought was possible. He'd become necessary, not because he was rich, not because he was connected, but because he'd learned to see people, because he'd learned that change was possible, because he'd learned that responsibility wasn't something that got imposed on you from the outside, but something you chose over and over again in 1,000 small decisions that added up to a life. One evening, Riley and James were sitting on the fire escape of her apartment, looking out at the lights of the city. And Riley said something that James had been waiting to hear since the first moment he'd met her. "I love you," she said simply. "Not because you saved me or helped me, but because you see me, because you chose to change, because you're still choosing to change every single day. That's real love. That's not grateful love or rescue love. That's actual love." James pulled her close and kissed her. And he understood that this moment on a fire escape in Queens, watching the city lights, holding someone who'd taught him how to be human, this was everything. This was the actual treasure. This was what life looked like when you stopped running from consequences and started building something real. The penthouse seemed like it had happened to someone else. The trust fund, the cars, the endless money, it all felt like a dream someone else had had. What was real was Riley's hand in his. What was real was the work they were doing. What was real was becoming someone you could actually respect in the mirror. The office wasn't fancy. It occupied the second floor of a converted warehouse in Astoria, with exposed brick and natural light streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows. The desks were used but sturdy. The computers were refurbished. The coffee maker was perpetually on the verge of breaking down. And it was the most beautiful space James had ever occupied. On the wall, there was a photograph from the opening day of the program 1 year ago. James was there, looking nervous and hopeful. Riley was beside him, beaming. Miss Deborah stood between them with her arm around both their shoulders. And underneath the photograph, there was a plaque. Second Chances Job Placement Initiative. Because everyone deserves a future. In the past year, the program had placed 237 people into jobs, real jobs. Jobs with benefits and stability and room for growth. 237 people who'd been invisible, forgotten, or written off by a world that didn't believe in second chances. James was at his desk, an ordinary desk, nothing special, reviewing applications for the next cohort, when his phone buzzed. A text from his mother. "Your father and I want you to come to dinner on Friday. We're inviting Riley and Miss Deborah too. We have some news we want to share with you." He smiled at the message. His parents had transformed as much as he had. They'd gone from being horrified by his decline to being genuinely interested in his work. His mother had started volunteering at the program on Thursday afternoons. His father had connected them with funding sources and corporate sponsors. The old James, the one who'd crashed a car into the river, who'd lived for parties and status, and the endless accumulation of meaningless things that James would have been, confused by his parents' genuine interest in his life. But the new James understood it perfectly. Love, real love, was about seeing who someone was becoming and believing in that becoming. Riley walked over with a folder. She was wearing professional clothes now, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. She'd gone from being homeless to being the assistant director of the program. She managed the day-to-day operations, coached clients, coordinated with employers. She was brilliant at it. "We have a situation," she said, pulling up a chair next to his desk. "One of our clients, remember Marcus? The one who'd been living in the park for 3 years?" James nodded. Marcus was one of their success stories. They'd placed him in a job at a warehouse, and he'd been doing well, really making progress. His former employer called, Riley said, wants to bring him in as a supervisor, with a raise, benefits expansion, everything. James felt that familiar swell of joy. Every single placement was a small miracle. Every single person who succeeded was proof that the system worked if you gave people a chance. "That's incredible," he said. "It gets better," Riley said. "He's recommending 2 other guys for positions, and he's offering to mentor them. That's how this works, James. That's how real change happens. People who have been helped deciding to help others. This was something James had learned over the past year. Transformation wasn't just personal. It wasn't just about him changing. It was about creating a system where change could ripple outward, where one person's second chance became the opportunity that created another person's second chance. That Friday night, James and Riley went to the penthouse for dinner. James hadn't spent much time there since he'd left. It still felt like a museum, though his mother had made some changes. Some of the more ostentatious art had been replaced with photographs. Family photos, photos from the program, photos of the people they were helping. His father greeted them at the door with genuine warmth, not the cold formality of before, but actual paternal affection. His mother hugged Riley like she was her own daughter, which in many ways she had become. Storytime wanted to talk about something, Richard said, once they were all seated at the dining table. Something that affects the family. And we wanted your input. James felt a flutter of nervousness. He'd learned to trust his father's instincts, but old reflexes were still there. The fear of judgment, of disappointment, of not being enough. Your mother and I have decided to establish a charitable foundation, Richard said, the Crawford Family Foundation. And we'd like you to be the primary administrator, James. We want to focus on housing and employment initiatives for people in transition. We want to expand your program to other cities. We want to make this systematic. We want to use our money to actually create change. James looked at his father, and he felt something shift in his chest. A full rotation of understanding. His father hadn't just believed in him through the worst of it. His father had actually understood what his son was trying to do and had committed his own resources to supporting it. What about the company? James asked. The real estate empire? We will hire a CEO, and we will be monitoring, Richard answered. Dad, James said, and his voice caught slightly. I don't know what to say. You don't need to say anything, Catherine said, reaching over and taking her son's hand. You've already shown us who you've become. We're just trying to catch up with you. They spent the evening talking about the expansion plans, how they'd establish the foundation, how they'd reach out to other cities, how they'd measure impact and build sustainable systems. But underneath all of that practical talk, there was something else happening. A family was being rebuilt, not because anyone was pretending to be someone they weren't, but because everyone had chosen to become better versions of themselves. Later that night, riding back to Queens in a regular car, not a luxury vehicle, just an ordinary Uber, Riley leaned her head against James's shoulder. Your parents are incredible, she said. They are now, James said. They always had the capacity to be. But they had to see me change first. I had to prove that it was possible, to actually grow. And then they gave themselves permission to do it too. That's how it works, Riley said. I've seen it with the clients. Their families see them changing, and they start to believe change is possible for them too. It's like transformation is contagious. Once one person catches it, it spreads. When they got back to the apartment, which still felt like home in a way the penthouse never had, James sat down at the small desk in the corner of Riley's room and started writing. He didn't know exactly what he was doing, but the words came anyway. He wrote about his week as a driver. He wrote about the transformation. He wrote about Riley and Derek and Patricia, the nurse and all the passengers he'd picked up. He wrote about learning what it meant to matter. He wrote about the difference between being important and being necessary. He didn't plan to do anything with it. He was just processing. He was just trying to understand his own story by telling it. But Riley found the pages the next morning and read them. When she finished, she had tears in her eyes. "You should publish this," she said. "People need to read this. People need to know that change is possible, that you can fall and come back up, that you can be terrible and then become good, that wealth doesn't buy you meaning, but work does." "I don't know if I'm a writer," James said. "You're not," Riley agreed. "But you're someone who lived something real, and you're telling the truth about it. That's more powerful than being a writer. That's testimony. That's witness." It took James several months, but he worked with an editor to turn his reflections into something publishable. The book came out under a small independent publisher first, From Penthouse to Purpose: How a Week as a Driver Changed Everything. He didn't expect it to do much. He was just hoping to sell enough copies to offset the publication costs. But something unexpected happened. People read it. Teachers assigned it to their classes. People in poverty saw themselves reflected in Riley's story. People in wealth saw a mirror that wasn't accusatory but invitational. The book wasn't about judgment. It was about transformation. It was about the possibility that all of us could be better than we are. The book led to speaking opportunities. James found himself in front of audiences of hundreds, telling the story of his week as a driver. And every time he told it, he thought about Riley sitting in the back seat of that Camry, talking about her fear and her hope and her absolute refusal to give up. Within 2 years, the Crawford Family Foundation had expanded the job placement program to 7 cities. They'd served over 1,000 people. They'd created a model that was being replicated by other organizations across the country. James was no longer just someone who'd learned a lesson. He was someone who was creating systemic change. But the most important thing, the thing that mattered most, was that it was all built on a foundation of real partnership. James didn't rescue people. He stood beside them. He believed in them. He helped create systems where change was possible. And Riley was there every step of the way, making sure that the work never lost sight of the human beings at the center of it. On the 3-year anniversary of the program, there was a celebration. 200 people came, people who'd been through the program, corporate partners, volunteers, donors. They shared stories of what had changed in their lives, jobs they'd kept, apartments they'd maintained, families they'd rebuilt, educational achievements, small moments of stability that had bloomed into real lives. And at the end of the evening, James stood on a small stage and looked out at all these faces, people he'd never have met if he hadn't been forced to drive that week, and he felt something like gratitude, not to his father for the punishment, though that had worked, but to all of it, to the failure that led to the punishment, to the suffering that led to the change, to Riley, who'd shown him what it meant to actually struggle. 3 years ago, he said, "I was a different person. I was selfish. I was thoughtless. I was wasting a life that so many people would have given anything to have. And I got a second chance. My father gave me a second chance, even though I didn't deserve it. He sent me out into the world to see how other people lived. And I met someone who changed everything." He looked at Riley, who was standing at the edge of the stage, and she was smiling. "I met someone who was braver than I'd ever been, who kept trying even when everything was against her, who taught me that meaning isn't something you inherit or buy. It's something you build, one choice at a time, one person at a time, one second, chance at a time. And she's not the only one. Everyone in this room has been brave. Everyone in this room has built something real. I'm just grateful to be standing here. I'm just grateful that I got forced to see what I was missing." The crowd applauded, and James saw Derek Paulson in the 3rd row. Derek, whose paralysis had become partial instead of complete, who'd become a disability rights advocate, who'd also found meaning in helping others navigate their own transformations. They'd become something like friends, bound together by harm and healing and the work of moving forward. This was the moral of the story, James thought. Not that money could buy redemption, not that one good week of work erased years of selfishness, but that change was possible if you were brave enough to actually do the work, if you were willing to see other people clearly, if you were willing to let other people see you. Life wasn't a penthouse overlooking the city. Life was a fire escape in Queens, watching the lights, holding the hand of someone who'd taught you how to matter. It was a Tuesday morning in late October, and James was at the office going through resumes when Riley walked in with coffee and an expression he couldn't quite read. It was somewhere between nervous and excited, which was unusual for her. Riley had become the kind of person who faced most things with steady pragmatism. "We need to talk," she said, closing the door to the small private office. James's stomach did a flip. Those 5 words had the power to terrify anyone, no matter how secure they were in a relationship. But before he could spiral into worst-case scenarios, Riley was smiling. "I got offered a job," she said. "A really good job, with the city. They want me to run a new division of workforce development. It's everything I've been working toward. It's meaningful. It's resources. It's platform." James stood up and pulled her into a hug. "Riley, that's incredible. That's amazing. Congratulations." But she didn't hug him back. She held herself slightly stiff, which meant something else was coming. "There's a catch," she said, pulling back to look at him. "The job is in Boston. I need to relocate. It's a 3-year commitment." James felt the world tilt slightly. He'd known, intellectually, that Riley wouldn't stay in this apartment forever, that she was going to grow and move and become bigger than the life they'd built here. But knowing something intellectually and feeling it were 2 different things. "Oh," he said. "I turned it down," Riley said. "I told them I couldn't do it. My life is here. You're here. The program is here. I said no." James felt something crack inside his chest. Not relief, which would have been his immediate selfish response a few years ago, but something more complicated. Sadness and love tangled together. "Riley, you can't turn that down for me," he said. "I did." "You can't," he said again, more firmly. "You've taught me something essential about being a good person, and one of the things you taught me is that you don't sacrifice your own growth for someone else. That's what you said about your mom, that you can't save someone else if they won't." "Save themselves? Well, I won't let you sacrifice yourself for me either." "It's not sacrifice," Riley said. "It's choice. I'm choosing this. I'm choosing us." "But let me finish," she said, and there was a firmness in her voice that stopped him. "I'm choosing us, which means I'm choosing what's best for both of us. And what's best for both of us is that you don't let me give up my dreams. Because if I do, eventually I'm going to resent you. And then this falls apart. And that's not what I want." James sat back down. He understood what she was saying. He understood the logic. But understanding and accepting were 2 different things. "So, what are you saying?" he asked carefully. "I'm saying I'm going to Boston," Riley said, "for 3 years. But I'm going as someone who has a partner here, not someone who's leaving. I'm going as someone who built something real that will exist without me. I'm going as someone who trusts that we're strong enough to do long distance. And I'm going as someone who's going to grow into an even bigger version of myself. And when I come back, I'm coming back as more." "What if I came with you?" James asked. "You could," Riley said. "But you shouldn't. Because this program needs you. It's grown beyond what we can do from New York. It needs to expand to other places. It needs directors in those places. And you need to be leading that expansion. You need to be the one making sure that the work doesn't lose its soul as it grows. I need to know that this thing we built together is still happening, still mattering, while I'm also building something new. That's not me leaving you, James. That's me honoring what we've created by trusting you to keep creating it. James understood then what Riley was teaching him. That love wasn't possession. Love wasn't about holding on to someone so tightly they couldn't become who they were meant to become. Love was about seeing someone's potential and pushing them toward it, even when it meant letting them go for a while. "I don't want to lose you," he said, and it was true and vulnerable, and the most honest thing he could say. "You're not going to lose me," Riley said. She came around the desk and took both his hands. "I'm going to Boston, and I'm going to do incredible work. And you're going to stay here, and you're going to do incredible work. And we're going to talk on the phone every night. And we're going to visit each other every month. And in 3 years, we're going to figure out what comes next. Together." "Promise?" he asked, and he sounded younger than he was. "I promise," she said. "But I need you to promise something too. Anything. Promise me that you're going to keep growing, that you're not going to use this as an excuse to retreat or get comfortable. Promise me that you're going to keep becoming more of who you're meant to be." "I promise," James said, and he meant it. Because Riley had taught him that the most important thing you could do for someone you loved was to insist that they become their best self, even if it meant sacrifice, even if it meant pain, even if it meant not having what you wanted in exactly the way you wanted it. That night, James called his father. He needed to talk to someone who understood what it meant to sacrifice personal comfort for the sake of what mattered. "She took a job," James explained. "A really good job. In Boston. She's going to be leading workforce development for the city. It's perfect for her." "And you?" Richard asked. "And I'm going to stay here and make sure the program keeps growing. We're going to be long distance for a while." There was a long pause. "Your mother and I did that," Richard said finally. "Early in our marriage. I had to be in New York for business, and she had an opportunity in London that was too good to pass up. We did a year apart. It was the hardest year we'd ever had. But it was also the year we learned that what we had was real, that it could survive separation, that it was strong enough to be put to a test." "How did you do it?" James asked. "How did you not just give up?" "We talked every day," Richard said. "We visited when we could. We were always intentional about staying connected. But more than that, we trusted each other. We trusted that the person we loved wasn't going to disappear just because there was distance. We trusted that absence would make us appreciate presence more when we had it." "What if we can't make it?" James asked the question that had been lurking underneath everything. "Then at least you'll know you tried," Richard said. "At least you'll know you gave it the best shot you could. And sometimes knowing that you gave something your best effort is enough, even if it doesn't work out the way you hoped." The 3 years of long distance were different than James expected. Harder in some ways, easier in others. They had to be intentional. They had to schedule calls. They had to make plans to see each other. There was no drifting into togetherness, the way you could when you saw someone every day. There was only choice, over and over again, to keep choosing each other. But something unexpected happened during those 3 years. The program grew in ways James couldn't have anticipated. He traveled to other cities. He trained other directors. He learned how to build systems that worked without him at the center. He became a speaker, not because he was famous, but because what he had to say mattered. And Riley, in Boston, built a workforce development program that became a model for other cities. She was interviewed by national media. She was invited to speak at policy conferences. She became a voice for people in transition, and that voice was powerful because it came from someone who'd lived it, someone who'd been homeless, who'd worked minimum wage, who'd understood from the inside what it meant to have no safety net. The night before Riley was supposed to move back to New York, James drove to Boston. He'd gotten to the apartment she'd rented for 3 years, and when she opened the door, he realized something fundamental had shifted. She was the same person, but also more herself. Her confidence had deepened. She'd grown into her power. She was someone who changed systems. Now, not just someone fighting to survive within them. "I thought about staying," she told him, as they sat on the floor of the empty apartment, surrounded by packed boxes. "After the 3 years were up, I got offered another job, something even bigger. I could have stayed." "Why didn't you?" James asked. "Because I promised you," she said. "But more importantly, because I realized that what we built together mattered as much as what I built in Boston. Because meaning isn't just about individual achievement. It's about what you build with other people. It's about the ripple effects of loving someone well." "I'm scared," James admitted. "I'm scared that things won't be the same. That 3 years apart will have changed us too much." "We will be different," Riley said. "We're both going to be different than we were. But that's not scary. That's good. That's growth. That means when we choose each other again, and we do, starting right now we're choosing each other as more evolved versions of ourselves." She took his hand and placed it over her heart. "3 years ago, I was brave enough to ask you to let me go," she said. "Now I'm brave enough to ask you to let me stay." James pulled her close, and they sat together in that empty apartment in Boston, and he understood that this was what real love looked like. Not possession, not fusion, but two people becoming their best selves separately, and then choosing to build something together. "I have a question," James said, "and it's not the kind of question I've ever asked before. I'm going to ask it, and I'm going to do it wrong, probably, because I've never done this. But I want to ask it anyway." He pulled out the ring he'd been carrying for weeks. It wasn't expensive. He'd learned that expensive didn't mean meaningful. It was made from recycled gold, and it had a simple stone, and it was beautiful because of what it represented, not because of what it cost. "Riley, will you marry me?" he asked. "Will you let me spend the rest of my life becoming the person you've taught me to be? Will you let me stand beside you as you continue to change the world? Will you let me see you and be seen by you for the rest of our lives?" Riley cried. And then she said yes, and then she kissed him. And James understood that he'd finally found what the penthouse had never given him. He'd found home. Not a place, but a person. A person who'd looked at his chaos and his selfishness and his privilege and had said, "I see who you could become, and I believe in that person." That belief had saved him. That belief had transformed him. That belief had made him real. 5 years. After the week that changed everything, James and Riley stood on the roof of their building in Jackson Heights, watching the sun set over Queens. It was their wedding day, and they'd decided to spend it simply just the two of them, and the city they both loved. They weren't in a fancy venue. They were in jeans and simple clothing. Riley wore a white sundress that she'd bought off a rack, not designed by anyone famous. James wore a shirt his father had given him, good quality, but ordinary. Their rings were simple bands, made by a local jeweler from recycled metal. "I can't believe we're actually married," Riley said, leaning against it, James's chest as the sky turned shades of orange and pink. "Are you happy?" James asked. "Deliriously," she said. "And terrified. And excited. And all of it at once. The way you feel when something real is happening." They'd invited their closest people to a dinner afterward. James's parents, Miss Deborah, Derek Paulson, some of the early program participants. Not a huge celebration, but an intimate gathering of people who'd witnessed the transformation, people who'd been part of it. "I want to tell you something," James said. "Something I haven't told you before." Riley turned to look at him. "I still think about the penthouse sometimes," he said. "I still remember what it felt like to be that person. And I'm grateful for it, in a weird way. Because if I hadn't been that lost, I never would have needed to find my way. If I'd been comfortable, I never would have had to change." "Do you regret it?" Riley asked. "Any of it?" "I regret hurting Derek," James said. "I regret the years I wasted. I regret how I treated people. But I don't regret the journey that came after. Because the journey taught me everything." "What did it teach you?" Riley asked. James thought about it. About the homeless shelter. About Patricia on the first day who'd told him to stop being afraid. About Derek's anger and eventual acceptance. About his father's ultimatum. About the first moment he'd seen Riley walking out of that shelter carrying nothing but hope. "He taught me that meaning doesn't come from what you own," he said. "It comes from what you build with other people. It taught me that strength isn't about having power over others. It's about having strength enough to lift others up. It taught me that love isn't about making someone into what you want them to be. It's about seeing who they are and believing in that, even when they don't believe in themselves yet." "That's good," Riley said. "That's really good. Now tell me the selfish thing you learned." James laughed. "What makes you think there's a selfish thing?" "Because you're human," Riley said. "And humans always learn selfish things too. That's part of being real." "Okay," James admitted. "The selfish thing I learned is that when you actually do something that matters, when you actually help people become their best selves, it feels better than anything money could buy. It feels better than penthouse parties, or fancy cars, or any of it. And that's selfish, because I do it partly because it makes me feel good. Not to judge my own motivations or anything, but yeah, I do it partly for me." "That's good, though," Riley said. "That's healthy. If you were only doing it for altruistic reasons, you'd burn out. The fact that it also makes you happy means you can sustain it. That you can keep doing it for the rest of your life without losing yourself." They stood in silence for a while, watching the sun slip lower and lower until the sky was all shades of purple and blue. Somewhere in the city below them, lights were beginning to turn on. Millions of lights, millions of lives, each one as complex and meaningful as their own. "I've been thinking," Riley said, "about what we do next." "What do you mean?" James asked. "I mean, the program has grown. It's in 12 cities now. It's helping thousands of people, and it's good work. But I think we need to think bigger. I think we need to write a curriculum. Something that organizations all over the country can use. Something that makes what we learned, that transformation is possible if you're willing to do the work. Something that makes that available to people everywhere." "That's massive," James said. "Yeah," Riley agreed. "But so was starting with one small program in Queens. And we did that. So maybe we can do this too." "We'd need help," James said. "We couldn't do it alone." "We'd ask for it," Riley said. "We'd build a team. We'd find people who believed in what we believed. and we'd make it happen." James pulled her closer. This was what he loved about Riley. She dreamed big, but she did it practically. She wasn't naive about what it would take, but she also never let the difficulty stop her from trying. "Okay," he said. "Let's do it. Let's change the world." The next morning, after the wedding celebration dinner, which had been exactly as intimate and real as they'd hoped, James sat down at his desk at the program office. His computer had an email waiting for him. It was from Derek Paulson. "I wanted to reach out with a proposal," it said. "I've been thinking about what I want to do with the settlement money I received from you. I've had 5 years to think about it, and I've realized that staying angry doesn't serve anyone. What would serve people is if I took that money and used it to fund accessibility programs for people with disabilities who are trying to enter the workforce. I want to work with your program. I want to create something that helps people who are disabled or dealing with chronic illness find meaningful employment. I know this might be weird, but I think we could do something really special together. Let me know if you're interested." James read it 3 times. Then he forwarded it to Riley with the subject line, "This is what redemption looks like." Over the next several months, James and Riley met with Derek and his team. They developed a framework for how the program could be adapted for people with disabilities. They created mentorship components. They worked with employers who'd historically been reluctant to hire disabled workers and helped them see that accommodation wasn't an inconvenience, it was just good management. Within a year, they'd successfully placed 47 disabled or chronically ill people into jobs. Derek came to speak at one of the anniversary celebrations, and he told the crowd something that made James cry. 5 years ago, Derek said, "James Crawford drove a car into a river and changed my life in a way he didn't intend. He took something from me, my certainty about my own body. But what I've learned is that tragedy is just the beginning of a story, not the end of one." James came to me and actually saw me, not as a victim, not as a pity case, but as a person who'd been hurt and needed to figure out how to live differently. And then he spent 5 years proving that he meant it. That's what real accountability looks like. That's what real change looks like. So I want to thank him, and I want to thank Riley, who saw possibility in people other people had written off. And I want to thank everyone in this room who's refused to give up on themselves or each other. After the event, Derek came up to James and they hugged. A real hug. Not the kind of hug between people who'd been hurt and were pretending it didn't happen, but the kind of hug between people who'd chosen to transform that hurt into something meaningful. "I forgive you," Derek said quietly. "I want you to know that. Not because what you did was okay, but because you've spent the last 5 years proving that you understand what you did and that you're committed to making sure it never happens again. And that matters. That actually changes things." James felt something release in his chest. Something he'd been carrying for 5 years. Not guilt. He still carried that, and he thought he always would. And that was right. But the burden of unforgiven harm, that finally lifted. On their first anniversary as a married couple, James and Riley took a rideshare car they still did, periodically, as a way to stay connected to the work they'd started. The driver was a woman named Sophia, and when she realized who they were, she had a story to tell. "I went through your program 3 years ago," Sophia said. "I was living in my car. My kids were with my sister. And I didn't think I was going to get them back. I didn't think my life was going to be anything but struggle. But someone put me in touch with your program, and they helped me get a job. And then another job. And eventually I got an apartment. And I got my kids back. And now I'm working for the rideshare company full-time with benefits. And I just got approved for a mortgage on a house. My kids are going to have their own rooms, their own space. She was crying as she talked, and Riley was crying too. Thank you, Sophia said, for believing in me, for making me believe in myself. This happened over and over, in coffee shops, in elevators, in random conversations with strangers who'd been touched by the work. And each time, James was reminded of why they kept doing it. Because change was real. Transformation was possible. People were capable of so much more than they believed about themselves. By year 7, the program had served over 5,000 people. The curriculum was being used in 50 organizations across the country. James and Riley had written a second book, this one focused on systems change and sustainability. They'd been invited to speak at universities and policy conferences. Their work had become part of the national conversation about poverty and employment, and what real support looked like. But the thing James was most proud of wasn't the statistics. It wasn't the growth, or the reach, or the recognition. It was the relationships. It was the people who called him years later to say, "I got promoted," or "I started my own business," or "I'm back in school." It was the knowledge that somewhere, out there, someone was living a better life because he'd learned to see them. On the 7th anniversary of that first week as a driver, James stood in the original office in Astoria, now a landmark of sorts, with a small plaque, and thought about the person he'd been, the spoiled, selfish, thoughtless version of himself who'd crashed a car and nearly killed someone. That person felt like a different lifetime, but he wasn't gone. James still felt the capacity within himself for selfishness, for carelessness, for the kind of self-absorption that had nearly destroyed Derek. The difference was that now he recognized those impulses when they arose. Now he had practices in place to interrupt them. Now he had people around him who wouldn't let him get away with becoming that person again. He had Riley, he had his parents, he had Derek and Miss Deborah, and the countless people they'd helped who'd taught him what it actually meant to be human. That night, as he and Riley sat on the fire escape of their apartment, the same fire escape where they'd first admitted they loved each other, James asked her a question. "Do you think I would have changed if my father hadn't forced me to drive that week?" Riley thought about it for a long time. "No," she said finally. "I don't. I think you were headed for something much worse. I think you were on a trajectory toward either total self-destruction or becoming someone completely hollow. Your father didn't create the need for change, but he created the opportunity for it. He forced you to see reality. And then you chose to do something with that sight. Do you think we would have found each other?" James asked. "Maybe not in the same way," Riley said. "But I think if you'd actually changed, if you'd become someone real, we would have found each other eventually. Because that's what happens when you become real. You stop being invisible to people. You attract people who are also trying to be real. It's like a frequency. Once you're on it, you find each other." James pulled Riley closer and thought about that. About frequency. About how becoming real had allowed him to meet someone else who was brave enough to be real. About how two people, who'd been invisible in different ways, him invisible because he had too much privilege, her invisible because she had too little, had finally become visible to each other. The city spread out beneath them, lights everywhere, millions of stories, happening simultaneously, and James understood that his story, the spoiled kid who became real, was just one story among millions. But it was his story, and it mattered. And the people it had touched, the lives it had changed, that mattered too. "I love you," he said to Riley. "I know," she said. "I can tell by the way you look at me, like I'm someone worth seeing." You are, James said. You're the person who taught me how to see. They sat on that fire escape as the night deepened, and James thought about the journey. From penthouse to purpose. From selfish to serving. From invisible to seen. It hadn't been a straight line. It had been messy and painful and complicated. But it had been real. And that realness, authenticity, the choice to become someone worth knowing, that was worth everything the penthouse could have offered him, and 1,000 times more. The countdown to change had begun on that first morning, when he picked up Patricia, heading to the hospital. But the real transformation had started the moment he chose to do something with what he learned. The real transformation had been built, day by day, choice by choice, in 1,000 small moments of seeing other people clearly and letting them see him. That was the lesson. That was the moral. That was what changed everything. It wasn't one dramatic moment of redemption. It was the daily, sometimes painful work of becoming better. It was the humility to admit you were wrong. It was the courage to change. It was the grace to forgive yourself while still holding yourself accountable. It was the love of people who believed in you enough to let you fail and try again. It was, in the end, incredibly simple. See other people. Really see them. Let them see you. Choose to become someone worth knowing. Choose it again tomorrow. And the day after that. Do that. And your whole life transforms. Not just your life, but the lives around you. The frequency shifts. The invisible become visible. The broken can heal. The selfish can become serving. The spoiled kid from the penthouse can become real. And that, James thought, as he held Riley and watched the city lights flicker below them, was everything.